One person's poverty is another person's paycheck. And that's the American way. That's as American as apple pie and high fructose corn syrup.
Kamala's plan to transform the criminal justice system and re-envision public safety in America.
That's right.
That is a hell of a job.
I think the biggest thing that I fear, or the thing that bothers me the most, is not just the amount of close friends and family members that I have who are currently incarcerated right now, but what's waiting for them when they come home.
There are a number of things we need to do. First of all, we need to just start with how we think about it. And I think about it mostly in the context of an age-old principle. You know, the Bible teaches us about redemption, right? The point being that we will all make mistakes. And for some, that mistake will rise to the level of being a crime. A civil society, a just society, a fair society allows people a way to earn their way back and give them the support to do that. We're not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm originally from Philadelphia, and I come from a community that for many people is very hopeless because mass incarceration and gun violence is a normal occurrence. And for a long time growing up, I just assumed that this was the norm, right? Seeing relatives go to prison. Both of my parents are repeat ex-offenders, and almost half of my brothers have spent time in incarceration. And I think for me, my struggle over the last 15 years in doing activism is understanding that the system is broken at every single angle. And I think most folks, particularly community members, at best believe the system is broken, at worst believe that the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to oppress and criminalize Black and brown folks. So I guess for me, beyond the policy and potential culture change that needs to happen with our criminal justice system, how do we restore or build trust with the public to look at our justice system as something that they feel comfortable calling the police, right? They don't see the police as the enemy, but rather someone who's there to help and alleviate the trauma.
Well, I mean, at the core, as you've said, the issue is trust. And there is a history and empirical evidence that supports that feeling of distrust. Right? So part of it has to be, one, that leaders acknowledge the history, right? People aren't delusional, people aren't making it up, people aren't hypersensitive. This is a fact. Yeah. You can look at the history in America of law enforcement enforcing Jim Crow. I mean, we can just go on and on. But then there is a piece that is about restructuring the system in a way that we actually create accountability. So that's about creating accountability for law enforcement and creating standards that are for prosecutors and police officers that are about requiring accountability and consequence for bad behaviors. Because part of the distrust is that the community also sees that when there is a violation of trust, there's no consequence. There are the issues that are about whose responsibility is it to build those relationships of trust. And I think for too long, we have put the onus on the community to build...
To be trustworthy enough, right?
Well, or to work on how the relationship, the reciprocal relationship of trust should occur, instead of putting the responsibility equally, if not more, on those who have actually created the distrust in terms of how the system works.
Agreed.
Right? And so that relates to a number of things. You know, when I was Attorney General of California, we created the first implicit bias and procedural justice training for police officers. Like, that needs to happen around the country.
You know, I think it's interesting that, we started this conversation and people are talking about reentry and we're talking about policing, but the shorthand we talk about for criminal justice reform is mass incarceration. I am frustrated by the fact that the national conversation has been so very little about the ways in which the full ways in which the community feels the effects of these systems. Talk about how this plan that you have and the way in which you're planning to campaign and then eventually to lead can recenter the community and in the proportion that the community is feeling the weights of these systems.
You know, a lot of it comes down to accountability. and I say this as a former prosecutor, when we talk about accountability in the criminal justice system, that word, it is always as applied to the person who is arrested. If we talk about consequence, it is always applied to that person. It is rarely applied to the system. Trust, at its core, is about a reciprocal relationship. You give and you receive trust. You don't just get trust without giving, right? And so if we're going to talk then about equal responsibility, there has to be equal responsibility around consequence and accountability. When I was Attorney General of California, I created the first in the nation open data system for any Department of Justice. And I ran, again, the second largest Department of Justice. Why did I do that? Because I knew too often folks are talking anecdotally about what's wrong with the system and have not been given the data or try to claw it out of the system. With public records requests, journalists try, advocates try. And I said, nope, we're going to open this up. Because when people start looking at the numbers, they will see that the numbers speak for themselves around disparities around arrest rates, around disparities around incarceration. It's going to be about shifting the responsibility from community to prove it to the government to prove it.
So, do you mind if I ask a follow-up on it? Because you're talking about accountability and shifting it over, and I know that, I'm from Philly too. Everybody in I won't say it's the greatest city in the history of the world.
It definitely is the greatest city.
I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't declare it openly. Right? I'm not asserting it. I'm just, it's on the record. It's not that I'm a scientist. I'm just saying it's proven. So I know every community will appreciate that.
Cut his mic.
This is not CNN. But I will say,
Shade.
I work inside a police department, right? And we work between police and communities. And oftentimes, those conversations feel hopeless, not just from the community side, but from the law enforcement side. They say, we're a tool. We're a political tool, and we're a tool of the community, and you're asking us to solve problems that we can't solve. And there have been consequences in these communities for generations.
Because we're asking them to solve poverty. We're asking them to solve mental health, and there's no differentiation of how we're actually utilizing the services within the system to actually meet the needs of the public. Instead, we're just calling the police for every single occurrence.
And that's the accountability that law enforcement, so I was telling Angela earlier today, I got a call from a chief yesterday saying, when are folks going to start talking about the trauma and mental health illness that's going on within law enforcement, who are witnessing the same thing in the communities that communities are feeling?
We shouldn't have to acknowledge that trauma because they're paid to be there. We live in these places. Police officers have historically not been held accountable because they protect and serve the rich, and then they just harass and take up space in poor communities. I don't see any type of big shift happening with the one term because it's like a cultural thing.
Right.
So how do we change that? And I think that's too much of a job for one person to sit here and say, well, if I win, I'm gonna switch culture. But how do we start to build towards changing that culture? And what does that conversation look like on a national scale?
I think part of the issue, stepping back, is the responsibility of law enforcement to make sure there is consequence and accountability for crime, or is the responsibility of law enforcement to ensure public safety?
Well, then that makes me ask you the question of how do you define justice?
Well, but then there's that, and there is that point. But the reason I go to public safety versus consequence and accountability for crime is that if the goal is public safety, then we have to necessarily get into, well, what creates safe communities? And what creates safe communities is recognizing that undiagnosed and untreated trauma among children who are growing up in high violence communities or in poverty, because by the way, poverty is trauma inducing.
Yeah, it is.
Poverty is violence, right?
I think part of the issue is that in some people's mind, the only way you achieve safe communities is to have a law enforcement presence.
For white communities.
It's crazy.
Right, but the point being that we have to reorder how people understand safe happens. Safe happens by having resources in a community. Safe happens by addressing undiagnosed and untreated trauma. Safe happens by having, literally economic opportunities. Safe happens when we're addressing undiagnosed and untreated trauma and understanding that can lead to self-medication, which is going to lead to drug addiction.
Yeah.
Right? And then drug addiction is going to lead to other acts of desperation, right? That will, eventually lead to incarceration. And so I just think that there is that part of it, which is also about us agreeing that among what we should think about as civil rights is the right to everybody to live in a safe community. Mm-hmm. And so then how do we achieve that? And if we think about it that way, then we understand, well, that's not going to be about reacting to crime after it happens. That's going to be about preventing it before it does. And then you don't have to be really creative to figure out what prevention looks like. It looks like putting those kinds of resources into a community.
And it's not like we haven't been doing that. We've been doing that in the suburbs for generations.
Right.
Right? It's not like we don't know how to have a public safety system where people feel comfortable playing in the streets. We have that all across America.
That's why people feel it's intentional, right? Yeah. I think one of the things I appreciate about your plan is like the reinvestment of community programs.
Yeah.
We know we spend more in this country per prisoner than we do per student. And so it talks about our priorities.
And there's a connection between those two facts.
Exactly. So how do you see education as a deterrent or other additional social services programs as deterrents to violence?
It's huge. Elementary school truant is 3 to 4 times likely to be a high school dropout. 70% of the prisoners in the United States are high school dropouts. A black man who is between the age of 30 and 34 and a high school dropout is 2/3 likely to be in jail, have been in jail, or dead. It's not complex math. Then let's connect that to another issue. If a black child has a black teacher before the end of 3rd grade, they're 13% more likely to go to college. If that child has had 2 black teachers by the end of 3rd grade, they are 32% more likely to go to college. Okay, now add another point. Black students come out of college with the highest amount by far of student loan debt. I could go backward and talk about how home ownership rates actually have a big impact on that, because how do you get student loan debt? Because you have to take out those big loans instead of your parent being able to say, honey, I'll just refinance the house to give you some of the money out of the house. We need more black teachers. We need to reinforce the public education system in America. Mm-hmm. We need to put resources into black and brown communities around public education, because we are seeing the highest rates of high school dropouts as compared to those white suburban neighborhoods. And it has nothing to do with the capacity of those children. It has everything to do with the fact that we are not putting the resources into those schools and into those neighborhoods. One of the biggest areas of focus is to infuse resources into public schools, because it's just a fact that the larger proportion of students who graduate high school, the less crime you're going to have in a community. It's actually just a fact. But there is also what we need to do around community mental health and putting resources back into that. I want to put a nurse in every school as part of my proposal, because, it is, often the first time that a child will have access to somebody other than that child's family is when they start school. And so that's going to be the first time objective eyes are set on that child that might be able to detect, oh, he actually just can't hear some stuff. We need to test his hearing. Or he needs glasses, as opposed to he's a bad child.
So what's the first step?
Well, there's the issue of mass incarceration. So that's going to be about what we need to do around sentencing reform, getting rid of mandatory minimums. I believe we need to legalize marijuana. We need to, decriminalize other aspects of what we're looking at in terms of drug addiction. There is what we need to do to take profit out of the criminal justice system. So that's part of my plan also, which is about shutting down private prisons. It's also about dealing with the issues like asset forfeiture that can impact the entire family. There's also what we need to do around bail reform and taking because it's an economic justice issue as much as it is anything. There is the work that we need to do, which my plan calls for, that is about law enforcement accountability. Because when there is that kind of accountability and consequence, I think we are going to see that there is a real deterrent then a real deterrent around bad police behaviors, around bad law enforcement behaviors. That includes prosecutors, by the way.
But every single one of those are huge, right? And know that in some instances, it will even take a shift, a paradigm shift of the way folks think
The way
about.
people think.
Yeah, like it takes that too. I mean, you think about some of the things that had to take place for a Civil Rights Act of 1964 to pass. So which of those, knowing they're all huge, all need to happen, but if you had to pick one, like I'm starting here, what would it be?
But Angela, I have to tell you, I've never been that person to say there's only one way.
No.
Or,
I'm not saying that.
But meaning that I do believe that we have the capacity. I mean, you're totally right. Listen, there is so much that as a prosecutor I wanted to take on, and I knew I couldn't get it all done, and I had to start somewhere. So I agree with that
Just
point.
the starting point.
Yeah, no,
not your
I agree
end
with that
point.
point. I think the law enforcement accountability piece, in terms of creating a national standard for that, is a major step. That is a real necessary next step, and that would be one of my areas of priority. That has to happen, because it's back to the first point about trust. It is about accountability.
I think most of us agree with the pillars that are in this plan, the fact that these things need to be addressed. What do we think should be a first step? Not the only step, the first step. Jamira, what do you think?
I would say the first thing that comes to mind is to reevaluate how the war on drugs has impacted communities of color, particularly looking at marijuana and the generational implications of that. So that would be my number one. How do we reevaluate that?
Yeah.
What about you, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know the entirety of my adult life has been about everybody who cares about something measures it, right? So businesses measure profit, right? Students keep track of their grades, families keep track of the height of their kids with pencil markings and door frame. We all gotta measure it, and we have not measured justice in the criminal justice system. And if we haven't measured it, can you imagine the neglect that communities feel from that? But measurement isn't just about the data, it's about the analysis.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
And I know you know.
Yes.
So, I'm excited about a national policing systems review board, and I'm excited about block grants that would go to the states.
That's right.
To make sure that it's not just, we're gonna make our data public, but we're gonna figure out the right ways to hold ourselves accountable. Because it seems easy just say make the data public, right? But the harder part is what part of this outcome belongs to us? What part of this can we do first to fix?
I think about the money when you talk about allocating funds to these different spaces to be able to attack these issues. How does the money make it into spaces that are really having an impact in the community versus the money making it to some organization ran by, some person who's just gonna take all of the money and put it in their pocket and use the leftovers to buy little Lunchables for kids in the projects. So how do you make sure we're making sure the money's going in the right place? And then how do we invest more into things that work? So I know in Baltimore, the Aim to Be More program is the model based on Back on Track. And I know a success story. One of my good friends, Bruce, was facing 20 years, first time offender, and he was able to get job training. He's home. He's trying to go to college. He has a girlfriend. He's living his life. He's a great kid. Yeah, he's doing. Shout out to Bruce. He's doing his thing. He's doing his thing, and that works. So how can something like that be mandatory, or how can we take stories like that and elevate them so high that all of these different systems see, look, this person got caught up in a bad situation. We're gonna make sure they get the resources they need, because I know everything that happened to me in my life. A huge element of it forced me into the wrong direction. So I know why I've done the things I've done, but I was lucky enough to be able to overcome that. He was lucky enough to be able to overcome that because of that system. So how do we highlight that and take these models and make other places use them?
Back on Track was the model for the program that you've described. And I'm going to tell you, when I started Back on Track, I would say to the graduates, and I attended every graduation, and I'm talking about young people who were picked up for drug sales, young adults, who, if the system had had their way, would be felons for life. And I saw who they are. I got graduation robes for each one of them for our graduation, because many of them had not graduated high school. I also knew that I was looking at young people who, a lot of them had never had another human being stand up and applaud them. And it's an extraordinary thing what that does for you. and your ego and sense of self to have had someone at some stage in your life applaud you. And I would say to each of the participants at the graduation ceremony, your success is going to benefit some young man or woman around this country who you will never meet and they will never know your name. But because we have proved this is a success here, it's going to happen around the country. And so I have to thank you for sharing the Baltimore story based on the Back on Track story, because I told these young people that that would happen. And Bruce
Bruce
is
the
a
man.
testament.
Bruce is living his best life, right?
Is a testament to all of that. And so part of it is when we talk about changing the system, we need to keep showing people that when you do this kind of thing, it really works. So we've got to keep telling Bruce's story, because there are still so many places in America that have not figured out the Bruce story. So that's part of my intention as president, because I've actually seen it. I know how it works. I know Bruce's story. We're still in the midst of trying to help people see a system that they've never seen before and imagine something they've never seen before. But thankfully, because of those of us who have charted new territory, we don't have to ask them to imagine, we can actually show them how it works. I am with you on that data thing. Listen, that was one of the reasons that I became Attorney General. And I said, this is the second largest Department of Justice. We got all this data. I'm opening this up. And I'm going to tell you there was incredible resistance to that. But we did it, and exactly to your point, because I knew within government, and within the government I was working in, there was not the capacity, much less the interest in analyzing it. So I threw it all out there for all the smart people to analyze it. Like, good, here you go, there you go, do it, right? And so that's part of what's behind my plan around creating a national database, is so that there's going to have to be that partnership where all the smart people at universities, all the activists, will then have the information to challenge and to put the checks and balances on government, to check themselves around their theories and around their practices. I do believe that at its core, that the failure of the war on drugs and how we've been approaching drugs in America is an indictment on the fact that one of the biggest public policy failures of our country has been to not address mental health. And we are paying an extreme price for that. And so that's why a large part of my plan actually is about what we need to do to put resources into federal grants, into federal funding around mental health, and the resources that are necessary in communities to actually address it. The issues of what we need to have in terms of meaningful programs around substance abuse. I hear what you're saying about, people who set up in communities saying they're helping everybody, but they're not really doing much, and we need to have audits and accountability for that. I'm with you, I know.
I hate them.
Including a lot of, we're getting into the detail, including a lot of substance abuse treatment programs.
Oh my God.
For which there is no real standard. In many communities, there are no substance abuse programs. So we're arresting people for a drug addiction issue. There are no treatment facilities, and there is nowhere for them to go except that they're being sent to prisons and jails. And we are treating jails and prisons as just major substance abuse treatment programs. And by the way, they're not getting treated there either.
Or if they do, it doesn't reciprocate when they leave.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's no continuum of service. And so that's why a big part of my plan is about dealing with the piece that has to be about meaningful federal resources being put into mental health and treatment, which includes the substance abuse treatment and meaningful substance abuse treatment. Because we know rich people get it. Rich people get it, right? They go to Betty Ford, they go to all this, and they're fine, right? We recognize that somebody in the community has a substance abuse challenge issue, it's a health issue, and there is literally nowhere for them to go. And then we expect that they're going to just be fine. And of course they're not, because they have a health issue that has not been addressed.
Mm-hmm. We haven't spent that much time on private prisons. I know that's a big issue of concern for a number of people in our community. And you speak in your plan about trying to take that private profit incentive out of the criminal justice system.
An associated issue is that you have previous members of this president's administration who have left the administration to go and be on boards of private detention facilities.
Yes.
And this is the point. People, the business model by its very nature is as follows. Certain human beings are making a lot of money off the incarceration of other human beings. Mm-hmm. There should never be profit associated with incarceration. Period. Period. How can we call ourselves a civil society? How can we call ourselves a society that values justice if we have systems in place where people literally make money, profit, off the incarceration of other human beings?
My hope is that that's also, I mean, that sounds like a principle that you've just stated.
Yes, it is.
So my hope is that comes out in immigration as well.
Yes, and that's why I brought that up.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
why I brought, and this is also a moment for, real significant coalition building, which is so important.
Yeah, because I mean, as bad as it is within sort of the traditional criminal justice system, private prisons are even a larger percentage of our immigration detention facilities.
Yeah.
Right? And so you see a reciprocal relationship between the folks who are lobbying for particular kinds of immigration detention laws and the people who are building those private incarceration facilities.
I'm glad you said that. That's the biggest part of the conversation that ties everything together. One person's poverty is another person's paycheck. And that's the American way. That's as American as apple pie and high fructose corn syrup. Like, but people, they're not gonna say it. Like, people aren't gonna, thank you for saying it, but people aren't really gonna say it. And I think sometimes I struggle, and just like we know this, and us knowing this is like a different type of trauma that people look like us are gonna have to pay extra to be able to experience success in this country. I don't know, I think therapy should be mandatory for young black people. I think if you're a kid, I think you should be.
I talk to my therapist every Sunday.
I think it should be incentivized.
Bless your heart.
I think like in these public schools, I think therapy should be incentivized. Like if you go to therapy like once or twice a week, it's set up inside of your school, you get like tickets to go to like an amusement park.
I don't know. I was part of setting up one of the first in the country that's called the Child Wellness Center. But here's the thing that we have to deal with too, to your point. There's a stigma.
Right, because what we're talking about is a fundamental mistrust of institutions that have historically failed vulnerable communities.
That is true.
Right, so it's the same way that I've got cousins and uncles and aunties who are like, oh, I ain't going to the doctor. They
I'm
give
not
folks
putting
syphilis.
my money in the bank, right? My grandmother still keeps her money
put it
in the wallet.
in the wallet or
the
in the
bra.
mattress.
The bra.
I don't wear one, so I wasn't going to. But
we wouldn't judge you. This is a safe space.
You do a clothespin in there.
My grandmother still does it.
My point is that folks have lost faith in certain kinds of government institutions. So can you talk about, I'm thinking about the conversation I had with my mother, who does not know that I'm here yet.
Okay.
But we talk about politics all the time. She says, I want someone to tell me why I can trust that this will be different. Right? I want someone to tell me why the plans that are coming together are going to look different for black women. She grew up segregated North Carolina.
Yeah.
Right? And you have at least as much, if not more, experience on this issue than anybody else who's going to be in the race, right?
Yeah.
Can't ever predict what's going to happen, but can you say something to my mom on that? Because I know she's going to be mad if I was here and I didn't ask.
I know firsthand how the system works from the inside out. And with that comes a level of authority to dictate how the reform needs to look and to know the levers within the system that need to be pushed to get it to where it needs to go. I can walk in a room and no one can ever question my background and my commitment to public safety. When I talk about all the reforms that are in my plan and why they are necessary, no one can question whether that is somehow going to be subversive of a system that has as its goal public safety. No one can ever question my credibility on that. So this is not about trying to reform a system for the sake of reform. It's about understanding that this is actually a much smarter way to do the business of creating healthy communities. And everybody benefits from that. You can also share with your mother that my plan is the only one that is very specific about what needs to happen around law enforcement accountability. And I say that having served a career in law enforcement, I know that there needs to be greater accountability. Nobody can ever say, oh, you're trying to be subversive or to, no, I know what needs to happen. And then the last point I'd make is this. Look, one of the most powerful tools in the hands of the President of the United States is when she holds that microphone. In terms of her ability to then inform perspective about a variety of issues. When I hold that microphone on this issue, there will be an ability, along with the background and credibility, to influence perspective about how this system actually needs to function to do the work of justice. Period.